I'm on a mission to get 500 pounds out of my 1993 2.3-liter Mustang Autocross car. So far, I've taken 135.5 pounds out of Apocalypso. Now, I'm going to do something I've never done before. Remove the sound deadening. Factory sound deadening material is weight that's low and in the center and rear of 79 to 04 Mustangs, Zone 2 and Zone 3. It's weight where you want it, which is why I haven't removed it from my other Autocross Mustangs. But Apocalypso has to be much lighter than my other cars, so the sound deadening has to go. When you remove the sound deadening, you are making the car better by making it worse. You'll lose a few pounds, but the car will be noisier. But how much weight will you actually lose? And how difficult is it to remove the sound deadening? This video covers the tools and tricks I use to get the sound deadening out of the interior of Apocalypso. In order to get the most accurate weight, I weighed a bucket on my digital bathroom scale, filled it with all the big chunks, little pieces, and dust I could collect, and weighed everything. Then I subtracted the weight of the empty bucket. I want to reiterate that I've never done this before in 30 years of working on my Mustangs. To prepare, I watched a lot of videos, asked people I know who've done this, and I made some educated decisions about how to accomplish it. If you're removing sound deadening for the first time, I recommend doing a lot of research, because advice, techniques, and experiences vary greatly. I had specific parameters for this project. I wanted to remove the sound deadening without damaging the panels or removing the factory primer underneath it. So I took my time. Most importantly, I wanted to make sure people watching this video could replicate my process if they wanted to. In order to do that, I used tools that most people would have or could easily acquire. I also wanted to test a trick I saw in several videos: freeze spray. As for the tools, I used a paint scraper, a gasket scraper, a chisel, a dead blow hammer, a ball peen hammer, an air die grinder with an 80 grit bristle disc, and an electric grinder with a 50 grit bristle disc. I used Sub-Zero medical grade freeze spray that cools down to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit in just 3 seconds. I also considered using heat and dry ice, but ultimately I didn't need either one. I started with the paint scraper, and the reason is pretty simple. There were areas of sound deadening with high edges, areas that were laid out over indentations in the floor pan, and areas that were brittle from age. You can see how easily those areas came out using the paint scraper. I was able to remove some large chunks of sound deadening with very little effort. When the paint scraper stopped being effective, I used the medical grade freeze spray. I hit the frozen areas with the ball peen hammer to shock them, but not hard enough to dent the floor pan. To be honest, I don't think the ball peen hammer made a difference. Then, I used the paint scraper on the frozen sound deadening. The freeze spray did help, but there's some fine print that I will detail later. Tapping the paint scraper with a dead blow hammer helped remove some of the sound deadening that didn't come off with the combination of the freeze spray and the paint scraper. In areas where the freeze spray, paint scraper, and dead blow hammer wouldn't work, I used the freeze spray, gasket scraper, and dead blow hammer. Using different combinations of the paint scraper, dead blow hammer, freeze spray, and gasket scraper worked everywhere except the rear wheel arches, which I will cover later. There was a lot of variation in how well each tool or combination of tools worked. The paint scraper by itself was much less effective in the driver's side footwell and the passenger side rear hatch area. The Sub-Zero freeze spray helped, but it wasn't a silver bullet that made removing the sound deadening simple. Freezing the sound deadening and tapping it with a ball-peen hammer didn't release the sound deadening from the floor pan. I still had to use the paint scraper, gasket scraper, and dead blow hammer. But using the freeze spray did allow me to remove sound deadening that wouldn't come off with just those tools. On any given panel, the freeze spray worked better in some areas than others, and only when I used it at the proper angle. The directions say, do not tilt can more than 40 degrees while spraying. The combination of the freeze spray and tools did a better job of removing the sound deadening and any residue from the panels. The freeze spray costs about $9 per can. I ended up using 3 cans. And even though it didn't magically release the sound deadening from the car, I would use it again. The gasket scraper worked very well, especially when used with the dead blow hammer. But the edge did mar the floor pan a little. Working slowly and carefully can prevent the gasket scraper from digging into the floor pan. In some places, the factory seam sealer made removing the sound deadening much harder. In others, the sound deadening came right off of the seam sealer. When the factory seam sealer came out with the sound deadening, I used 3M seam sealer to fill in the gaps. I cannot stress enough that in some areas the sound deadening was significantly harder to remove than in others. I am by no means an expert in sound deadening removal, but based on my experience, I think it's safe to assume you shouldn't expect the level of difficulty to be consistent from panel to panel or car to car. The rear hatch area is a perfect example. It took 1 hour to remove the sound deadening from the passenger side, but the driver's side only took 10 minutes. The passenger side footwell took an hour and 15 minutes. The driver's side footwell took 1 hour. The transmission/drive shaft tunnel took 1 hour and 7 minutes. The rear seat bottom area took 2 hours and 3 minutes. The area behind the rear seat took an hour and 10 minutes. The wheel arches had the toughest sound deadening. I tried the paint scraper, the freeze spray, the gasket scraper, and the dead blow hammer. But the sound deadening on the passenger side wheel arch wouldn't come off. So I tried a chisel, but even the chisel didn't work. I wound up using an air die grinder with a bristle disc and an electric grinder with a more aggressive bristle disc. That combination was finally able to get all of the sound deadening off the passenger side wheel arch. But it removed the factory primer. Because I spent a lot of time trying to get the other tools to work, it took 1 hour and 46 minutes to do the passenger side. But, as was common for this process, the driver's side wheel arch sound deadening came off easier using the freeze spray, chisel, and dead blow hammer. I wanted to keep the factory primer in place, so I chose not to use the grinders to get the driver's side down to bare metal. The driver's side wheel arch took 1 hour. I primed and painted the passenger side wheel arch and scuffed and painted the driver's side wheel arch. On the other panels, there was residue left behind, as well as small, stubborn pieces of sound deadening. If I decide not to put a carpet in this car, I'll have to paint the floor pan to give it a finished appearance. I needed something that could clean off the panels without removing the factory primer. I used automotive Goo Gone, and I was extremely impressed. I sprayed it on, waited about 10 minutes, then wiped it up with a rag. The Goo Gone got 95% of the residue off with hardly any elbow grease required. A kitchen sponge with a scouring pad handled the rest. Working in sections and giving the Goo Gone time to soften the residue, it took about 1.5 hours to get the entire floor pan clean. You have to wash the remaining Goo Gone off with soap. Some Windex and paper towels did the job. The sound deadening took 10 hours and 31 minutes to remove, and 1.5 hours to clean up the residue. It was a mix of finesse, force, frustration, and fun. It became a game to see how much of the sound deadening I could get out. I won't go so far as to say I enjoyed it, but it wasn't a terrible, tedious task. It was really satisfying to see the floor pan come clean. After all that time and effort, how much weight did I actually lose? 12.3 pounds. Between the grinders atomizing some of the sound deadening and the residue not being collected, I'm sure I missed some weight. But not much. Right now, you're probably asking yourself, is it worth it? Well, when you're trying to get 500 pounds out of a car, yes. I can't say exactly how much came from Zone 2 and how much came from Zone 3, but looking at the footprints of the sound deadening, I'd estimate it was 80% in Zone 2 and 20% in Zone 3. So I'm going with 9.84 pounds from Zone 2 and 2.46 pounds from Zone 3. With the sound deadening removed, I've taken 147.8 pounds out of Apocalypso. 0.56 pounds from Zone 1, 82.59 pounds from Zone 2, and 64.66 pounds from Zone 3. In order to improve the weight distribution, I have to take weight out of Zone 1. The next video in this series will focus on getting free and inexpensive weight out from under the hood.